Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Andrew Feenberg.
Well, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm glad so many people showed up to listen. This is a talk about a book, or it's from a book that I just published, which I'll circulate. But I do want it back at the end. The first version of this book was written over 30 years ago. And in the interim, I learned a few things and decided to go back and revise it and redo it. And it turns out that it's timely. It's a book about the history of Marxism, a Marxist philosophy. And if Mr. Piketty can sell hundreds of thousands of copies of a book called Capital, surely I can sell a few called The Philosophy of Praxis. So this talk is about one of the central themes of the book. It's the theme of the concept of reification, which is a critical notion for not only for Lukács, the main author who inspired this book, but for the Frankfurt School. So just before I really get going, let me just say a word about who Lukács was, so you, in case you're not well informed about the obscure history of Marxism. In the 1920s, Lukács was an important figure in the Hungarian Communist Party. But before that time, he was a prominent literary critic and a rather, not a radical literary critic, not a Marxist critic. I'm not sure how to describe him, but he was very influential as a literary critic. And then the World War I seems to have radicalized him, and he joined the Hungarian Communist Party. And in 1919, the Communist Party and the Socialist Party in Hungary seized power, and he served as the Minister of Culture. That lasted a very short time. Then a fascist regime took over, even worse than the one today. And he went into exile, and he wrote a book called History and Class Consciousness, which is a very exciting work of Marxist philosophy. He absorbed all the most important intellectual currents of his time, unlike the Marxist philosophers who ended up being most influential in Russia. And of course, Russia became the center of the communist world and determined most of what people thought about Marxism for generations. Lukács's book was an obscure contribution. It was read by intellectuals like Horkheimer and Adorno and Marcuse, but it didn't have a wide influence. Then it was rediscovered in the 1960s, and that's when I discovered it. And I wrote a doctoral dissertation on Lukács for Marcuse in San Diego, and then later on wrote the first version of this book. There is an interesting story about Lukács I'll tell you just to humanize him a little bit. In 1956, after the fascists took over in Hungary, he went to Russia, and he stayed in Russia and became a world-famous literary critic, the most famous Marxist literary critic. And he stopped writing about these contentious philosophical issues. But after the war, he was able to go back to Hungary, and he continued writing literary criticism until 1956, when there was a revolution in Hungary, and a revolutionary regime was established that called itself communist, but was not tributary of the Soviet Union. And they invited Lukács to be again a minister in the government. He had been a minister of culture in the first communist regime, and now he was again minister of culture. And this lasted a short while until Russia invaded Hungary and crushed the revolution. And then all the leaders, the government leaders, were shipped off to imprisonment in Romania. I'm not sure if they all went there, but Lukács went there. And he spent a good deal of time in Romania waiting to be tried, because he didn't know if they executed some of these people. He tells the story that when he was arrested by the Russian troops, they asked him to surrender his arm, and he took out his pen and gave it to the officer arresting him. And he was a great foe of modernist literature and wrote critical things about Kafka. But after spending several months in a Romanian chateau waiting to be tried and perhaps executed, he's supposed to have told his wife that after all, Kafka was a realist. So he's an interesting character. And I'm going to talk here just about his philosophy, so I thought I'd start by giving you a few stories about him as a person. Okay, so to begin, let's define reification. I'm using the term in the sense in which it was introduced by Lukács in History and Class Consciousness in 1923. That classic work of Marxist philosophy had a great influence on the Frankfurt School. You will find references to reification in Lukács' sense in Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse. Reification, according to Lukács, means taking social relations for things. This definition follows from the etymology of the word, since res is the Latin word for thing, hence thingification. An institution, for example, a university, is in reality a complex of social relations, but it appears as a solid and substantial thing, like a natural object. Breaking with the illusory thinghood of social institutions and recovering their contingency, Lukács calls dereification. This idea is usually explained as a theory of ideology, but implied in the contrast between social relations and things is a deeper argument concerning the nature of action, or practice, as Lukács calls it. At this level, the theory of reification provides structure. At this level, the theory of reification explains the relation of structure to agency. Reification provides structure through determining a specific type of practice that stabilizes and reproduces the institutions, while dereification involves another type of practice with the power not only to penetrate the illusion of reification, but to transform the structures it establishes. So, because we all act like SFU is a university, SFU is a university. It's a reified object, but it's contingent on our believing in it, right? Acting according to the rule of the type of object that it is. But dereifying the university is something that we're not encouraged to do by the administration. That would interrupt the actions that reproduce the institution as a stable structure. That would be an exercise of agency, right, in the sense of the term I'm using it here. I want to illustrate this correlation of reification and dereification with a story about the medieval Japanese sword maker Masamune, reputed to make the sharpest blades. This account is from Suzuki. So here's the little story. Masamune flourished in the latter part of the Kamakura era, and his works are uniformly prized by all the sword connoisseurs for their excellent qualities. As far as the edge of the blade is concerned, Masamune may not exceed Muramasa, one of his ablest disciples. But Masamune is said to have something morally inspiring that comes from his personality. The legend goes thus. When someone was trying to test the sharpness of a Muramasa, the disciple, he placed it in the current of water and watched how it acted against the dead leaves flowing downstream. He saw that every leaf that met the blade was cut in twain. He then placed the Masamune, the master, and he was surprised to find that the leaves avoided the blade. The Masamune was not bent on killing. It was more than a cutting implement, whereas the Muramasa could not go beyond cutting. There was nothing divinely inspiring in it. The Muramasa is terrible. The Masamune is humane. One is despotic and imperialistic. The other is superhuman, if we may use this form of expression. End quote. This charming story illustrates the two different types of action, reifying and dereifying action. The sword of the disciple is purely technical. It obeys the law of war, under which the technique of killing stands. The sword of the master, Masamune, is special because it acts on the law of war itself, rather than simply acting under its horizon. The Masamune illustrates action on the logic of action, rather than technical action in conformity with that logic. It is important to note that reification in this Lukácsian sense is not just an attitude or opinion. Lukács argues that it is the form of social appearance, the way in which things give themselves to consciousness in capitalist society. Appearances are not subjective. Here's an example of what I mean. The investor on the stock market sees the economy as it appears to investors, that is, as a gigantic sum of opportunities to profit. Because the economy appears in this way, the investor treats it as an object of technical manipulation. But that is precisely what reproduces the stock market from one day to the next. Lots of investors trying to manipulate their way to profit. Well, the market isn't a thing, it's a process that's produced daily by everyone treating it as a thing. This example shows how the capitalist system is implicated in its reified appearances and how those appearances contribute to its reproduction. Having given you a brief definition of reification, I want to talk now about the background to Lukács's formulation. I will focus on the intellectual world of his time and on his Marxist heritage, the two sources he attempted to synthesize. As Germany modernized rapidly at the end of the 19th century, science and technology became objects of critique. Philosophers and social theorists tried to save something human from the technological flood. This was the atmosphere in which German thinkers developed an elaborate theory of the difference between the humanities and natural sciences, two different ways of understanding the world. They distinguished the fields by their method: interpretation for human and cultural knowledge, and explanation by law for nature. In sum, a human world of meanings and a natural world of causes. This duality is central to the development of thought in Germany in the period from the end of the 19th century to the First World War, even afterward. This distinction was politicized by certain right-wing thinkers in Germany. According to them, Germany was a culture nation dedicated to art and beauty, while England and France were characterized by a materialistic civilization interested only in machines and money. So this is the famous distinction of culture and civilization. The great German sociologist Max Weber elaborated a more theoretically interesting version of the distinction. He described what he called rationalization, the growing significance of calculation and control in the administration of modern society. He contrasted this with a pre-modernity based on custom and tradition. This was the background against which Lukács appropriated the contemporary critique of science and technology. With the theory of reification, Lukács joined the critique of science and technology to the Marxist critique of capitalism. Weberian rationalization was the bridge between the two aspects of his theory. So you understand, he's, on the one hand, society is technologizing, and this becomes a focus of concern. Humanistic intellectuals denounce this. I mean, you're all exposed to this kind of criticism. For example, everyone's read Brave New World, right? That's a pure product of this current of fear, anxiety about the dystopian implications of scientific and technical developments in the early 20th century. So that's generally a right-wing critique, but Lukács co-opted it for the left, which is a unique move on his part. No one had ever tried this before. And the way he did it was by incorporating rationalization theory into Marxism. Weberian rationalization was the bridge between the two aspects of his theory. Here is how he explained it. Now, I'm going to read you a passage. It's very tangled prose, but this is, the German of a guy on the run from the cops in the 1920s who studied too much philosophy. So here's how he explains it. What is important is to recognize clearly that all human relations assume increasingly the form of objectivity of the abstract elements of the conceptual systems of the natural sciences and of the abstract substrata of the laws of nature. And also, the subject of this action likewise assumes increasingly the attitude of the pure observer of these artificially abstract experiences, the attitude of the experimenter. So it's important to recognize that all human relations assume the form of objectivity of natural science. people's relationships, and he's mainly thinking of social life, not personal life, right, begin to resemble the kinds of relations people have to nature in a technological society, where their mentality is determined by science rather than by tradition or custom. And then the people themselves become technical manipulators in such a situation. And so he calls this the attitude of the experimenter. What is Lukács saying in this passage? The form of science, the logic of its explanatory method in terms of laws, spreads to the whole social system under capitalism. Everything begins to resemble nature as it takes on this form of appearance. Not only does the society become a kind of second nature, but the individuals begin to relate to it in a purely technical manner, with the detachment and disinterest of a scientist engaged in an experiment. Society becomes a collection of things, like nature, fragmented into particulars connected only by external relations, and quantified, either given a price or measured in other ways. What is the ranking of SFU? The social world so understood is instrumentalized by the individuals as an object of technical control. This is reification. The Marxian background to Lukács's argument explains how these aspects of scientific explanation and experimentation have become a culture. That's the weirdness that Lukács is trying to explain. Well, we are the fish who swim in the water, so we don't know how wet we are, right? But it's very weird to live in a society that has a culture that's based on scientific and technical and mathematical concepts instead of on stories about the gods and how they created us and so on. That's very strange. We're the first peoples in history to have such a strange culture. And this is what he's trying to explain. Marx introduced the concept of the fetishism of commodities to describe the effects of the market. Everything acquires a price under capitalism, and price, a mere number, becomes more real, more effective than the actual qualities of the things, because it is price which governs design decisions, moves things from place to place, and determines whether they exist at all. The quantification of social reality through pricing corresponds to the quantification of nature performed by natural science. Lukács also drew on Marx's analysis of the relation of the worker to the machine. Under capitalism, technical innovation aims to de-skill labor and reduce the worker to a mechanical part of the production system. The worker is now an external manipulator of a self-acting mechanism rather than the center of production with tools in hand. The relation to the machine parallels and confirms the relation to the economy. In both cases, action is reduced to individual technical manipulation of a world with its own unchangeable laws. These are examples of alienation as Marx developed that concept in his later work. As Marx put it, under capitalism, dead labor, the accumulated product of past work, dominates living labor. What Lukács adds to this original Marxian notion is the idea that the form of the domination resembles scientific law. Reification is a type of alienation characteristic of a scientized or technologized society. I want to dig a bit deeper into this concept of form. I said at the beginning that capitalist society depends on a certain form of appearance. Lukács calls this a form of objectivity. That's the technical terminology of the philosophers of his time. He writes, quote, "The structure of commodity relations can be made to yield a model of all forms of objectivity of bourgeois society and all the corresponding forms of subjectivity," end of quote. The concept of form of objectivity refers to the way in which objects present themselves to a specific look. For example, if you are a physicist, you look at the world in your work as matter in motion. That is the type of object with which you are concerned. Naturally, you have to leave out a lot of other aspects of nature in order to focus on the one that interests you. This way of constructing objects of concern is not confined to physicists, but rather characterizes all perception. We all look at objects from a certain angle that corresponds to the type of object they are for us. This way of thinking about perception belongs to Kantian philosophy, which was very influential at the time Lukács was writing. According to Kant, we impose a form on the raw materials of experience, which in themselves lack order and meaning. In Kant and his neo-Kantian followers, the forms are purely logical. For example, Kant believed that causality was one of these forms. Causal form is an a priori assumption we make when we look at the succession of events. We always assume that what happens has a cause in the past, even when we don't know what it is. So in other words, we don't go around from day to day generalizing from our experience that most things do happen to have causes. We take the idea of causality to things before we even experience them. It's an a priori, prior to experience concept. So the world is the kind of object that has a cause, according to Kant. The things in it have causes. Now, causality in this Kantian sense is definitely not a thing in the world like the contents it forms. It is not related practically and materially to its contents. I mean, think about it. If you were wearing rose-colored glasses, the world would be rose. That would be an a priori form of objectivity. But there's no material connection between the world and your rose-colored glasses, right? So the a prioris are not related practically and materially to their content. The very idea would seem absurd to Kant. Here is where Lukács innovated. He argued that the forms of the social world are the economic categories of capitalism. But these are entities within the world and not simply logical a prioris. This has bizarre implications when you apply it to the relation between form and content in the life of the worker. Wage labor is the form and a life process is the content. Here is how Lukács argues. Another quote, a long quote. This is easier than the last one. The quantification of objects, their subordination to abstract mental categories, makes its appearance in the life of the worker immediately as processes of abstraction of which he is the victim and which cuts him off from his labor power, forcing him to sell it on the market as a commodity. And by selling this, his only commodity, he integrates himself into a specialized process that has become rationalized and mechanized, a process that he discovers already existing, complete and able to function without him, in which he is no more than a cipher reduced to an abstract quantity, a mechanized and rationalized tool. The quantitative differences in exploitation, which appeared to the capitalist in the form of quantitative determinants of the objects of his calculation, must appear to the worker as the decisive qualitative categories of his whole physical, mental, and moral existence. So from the standpoint of capital, the worker is worth, $12 an hour. From the standpoint of the worker, there's a lot more going on, which is somehow lost in that quantification. So the life of the worker has become mere content formed by the capitalist economy according to the logic of the labor market. But the form cannot fully embrace the content. What Lukács calls the qualitative categories, the physical, mental, and moral life of the worker, overflow the quantitative form of wage labor. The gap between form and life is known to the worker, if not to the capitalist. It is obvious to the person who actually lives it when, for example, the rate of wages is too low to support a family. This knowledge of the gap between form and content is a kind of self-knowledge. The worker knows himself or herself to be more. The worker knows that he or she is more than a worker. In this sense, the worker is the self-consciousness of the commodity. He or she is therefore in an essentially critical relation to the forms of the capitalist economy. This is the basis for class consciousness, the precondition of revolution. Lukács shows that class consciousness is not simply a matter of belief, but rather a tension between form and content, appearance and reality in the structure of capitalism. According to Lukács, and here he follows Marx, when workers become class conscious, they are able to unite in order to change the fundamental logic of social life. This is a process of de-reification that overcomes the effective formation of the world according to the logic of capitalism. De-reification makes possible a new system with different social laws from those of capitalism. Under the socialist system, goods are produced to fulfill human needs rather than according to market demand. Individuals no longer have to act individually in a technically manipulative manner on an alienated society, but can combine to change the social laws under which they live. Now I can show you how Suzuki's story fits the case. The concept of revolution corresponds to Masamune's sword. It is not technical action under the horizon of the established laws, but action on the laws themselves. De-reification is thus a different kind of action from the instrumental action determined by capitalism. It implies a different kind of subject, a collective subject oriented toward human needs, rather than an individual subject in pursuit of profit and personal advantage. The distinction is significant for us because it helps to understand the failure of versions of socialism that rely on political controls and economic planning rather than the mass movement. This technocratic form of socialism prevailed in the Soviet Union. It is usually criticized with normative arguments about democracy, but how can we ground the preference for a bottom-up socialism without such arguments? Lukács provides an original answer. There is something more basic than economic institutions, and this is the mode of action favored or excluded by the system. Capitalism and Soviet-style socialism depend on the reification of society. They individualize the members of society and force them into a manipulative relation to the system. The de-reification of society would open other possibilities. We can verify the importance of this distinction in reflecting on our own radical politics in late capitalism. When Marx wrote, and even in Lukács's day, most technology was found in factories. Workers were assembled in large masses by the technologies they used and could therefore resist capitalism collectively as they became class conscious. Since 1923, a few things have changed. Marcuse noted this when he wrote, quote, when technics becomes the universal form of material production, it circumscribes an entire culture. It projects a historical totality, a world, end quote. Technology is no longer to be found mainly in factories, but is now involved in every aspect of social life. The generalization of technical mediation has extended reification well beyond its earlier economic limits. Reified technical disciplines of all sorts reflect and determine every aspect of life, and not just the economy. So this is obvious, right? I mean, we don't even think about it much, but I mean, in the good old days, universities were run according to customs and traditions. Today, there's a computer running the university. Everything is quantified and kept track of. It's calculation and control, the good old Weberian rationalization, right? Which has replaced the Mr. Chips style traditional operation of the university. And I mean, this is true in every institution, medicine, everywhere we encounter a social institution, it's been rationalized. And it's often technically based on technology, like the computer. So we live in a technologized world. And so even though the proletarian revolutionary movement has declined, other movements have arisen which resemble it insofar as technology continues to assemble masses of people in reified forms. The environmental movement is an example. Obviously, there are big differences. The economic logic of capitalism is not the only reified form against which people protest. The design of technology and technical systems have similar effects. Well, let's be clear, I'm not saying that these movements around technical issues can replace the proletarian movements of the past, but I am affirming their fundamental importance in any society based on modern technology. Okay, so technological design is the reified form against which people struggle in these movements. This is more difficult for the users and victims of technology to understand than the failure of the economic forms in the life of a factory, but the potential is there. For example, pollution can produce a latent collective in the affected community. I call it latent because there's no special reason why the people who are being poisoned should know that they are in this together, right? Unlike workers who assemble around machines in a factory. But it's still a collective. It's just latent. The members of the community are all connected by the polluting technology, even if they are unaware of the fact. When the consequences become known, the community can become self-conscious in Lukács's sense. They become aware of themselves as, right? In this case, as victims of some factory, say, which is poisoning the water in their neighborhood. there is a mismatch between technological form and human life processes. This is the basis of local environmental protests, such as the one at Love Canal, which launched the anti-toxics movement in the US. The established form cracks as its limits are revealed. Other examples can be found in the field of medicine. For example, the women's health movement, or the movement of AIDS patients to obtain access to experimental drugs in the early stages of the struggle with the disease. I mean, those are both cases I studied. In the case of women's health, one of the big social movements of the 1970s, which was never really interpreted as a political movement by the left, but it was a political movement, was the Lamaze childbirth, natural childbirth movement. Millions of women demanded that hospitals use less anesthetic, give them some childbirth training so they'd be physically better prepared to give birth. And since this was the period of the baby bust, the hospitals had too many maternity beds and couldn't resist. They wanted to. They didn't want to waste time and money training women to give babies when they could do it perfectly well with their instruments and tools in the delivery room. And they didn't want husbands or friends to come into the labor and delivery rooms, unsanitary individuals. But they gave in because they had to. They had to fill those beds. And there are so many women who demanded this that they were able finally to accept that they had to adjust. Well, what did that do? That changed the practice of childbearing at a certain moment in history, but it also changed the technical discipline that doctors were trained in medical schools so that they would learn a different technology, right, of childbirth, one that included these oddities like husbands or partners in delivery rooms. That became conventional, accepted, to the point where today nobody remembers this stuff I'm talking about. It's just part of the science of medicine, right, that the husband can come in because it's good for the baby and so on. You can see how flexible technology is, right? It'll adjust to anything within reason. The same with the AIDS patients. In the 1980s, the only hope, you know that most of the people who contracted AIDS in the early phase died. Very few survived. And so it was a terrible epidemic. And because it takes so long to show up, there was no way for people to control their behavior on time, right? So hundreds of thousands of people were affected. Well, scientists, of course, wanted to cure the disease, so they developed experimental therapies. But they designed the experiments in such a way that very few patients could participate, just the number needed to have statistically significant results. The patients said, hey, that's our last chance. Let us in. And they had a social movement going for them, the gay rights movement. So they were, like the women, you know, they had the contingent circumstances made them powerful. I mean, it's easy to intimidate a bunch of scientists, right? Just throw a little blood on them, something like that. So gradually they negotiated a deal. You know, you see on the TV news now, Anthony Fauci, the guy from the NIH, he was one of the people who helped arrange this. And they allowed the patients in. So the patients changed the protocols of experimental medicine. Again, largely forgotten. Now it can all be done cheaply in Africa. But at the time, it was a huge revolution in the understanding of clinical research in medicine. Today, we have a movement that's just as significant. Again, it's not always signified as a left movement because the left is, you know, kind of narrow-minded about what it thinks it's willing to take on board. But it's the movement around protecting the internet from ultimate and total commercial domination. And the key factor in that movement is net neutrality. That's the key demand. To maintain that all the data flows be equal, keep them equal, so that there's no high-speed, highly paid data flows that crowd out the things we do on the internet, which are mostly, you know, looking up things on Google and sending email. But we're not paying for that. So in a society like ours, do we really have the right to all that free service? Shouldn't we be paying something, or if not, maybe go to the library instead of using this free resource. So the struggle to protect the internet pops up occasionally when there are particularly aggressive attacks. Recently, there were enormous numbers of people signing into petitions to the White House and to the FCC to try and protest new rules. Who knows how this will end? But for the moment, the internet is the most important and visible locus of struggles over technology. Examples like these show the emergence of what Foucault called subjugated knowledges among the ordinary people subjected to various forms of technological alienation. Just as workers in the original Marxist schema were said to gain insight into the limitations of capitalism from their subordinate vantage point, so do ordinary people engaged as users or victims of technology today. As Fred Jameson writes, quote, "We need to make an inventory of the variable structures of constraint lived by the various marginal, oppressed, or dominated groups, the so-called new social movements, fully as much as the working class, with this difference that each form of privation is acknowledged as producing its own specific epistemology, its own specific view from below, and its own specific and distinctive truth claim," end quote. The experts' reified technical disciplines are incomplete. This is the basis for a conflictual dialogue between lay and expert that is increasingly a factor in the social life of all modern and modernizing societies. Okay, so let me conclude. Lukács's concept of reification gives us a powerful way of thinking about social struggle. His concepts of reification and dereification enable us to understand the different modes of action involved in living under and resisting institutions and technologies. We are constantly between the swords of Masamune and Muramasa, and we need to be clear on the difference between them. But learning to wield Masamune's sword is difficult. We are a long way from such mastery. So that's the end. Okay, I tried to keep it short and sweet, so there's plenty of time for discussion, and I'm hoping you will come up with some good themes for discussion. I see a hand. Yes?
So Lukács's reification was he applied it to in regards to capitalist society.
Right.
Did he say anything about applying or maybe modifying reification and reification and dereification? The reification theory in regards to, let's say, for example, communist states, or nothing?
He wrote about this in 1923, and it was still possible to be a part of the communist movement and to express views that diverged from those of Lenin and Engels in philosophy. But within a year or two, he was denounced by all kinds of pro-Soviet philosophers and pretty much forced to choose between philosophy and Russia as a place of exile. And he didn't want to go west. He wanted to keep faith with the proletarian movement, so he went to Russia. And that meant he had to just drop all this. So he wrote, in 1924, he wrote a very interesting manuscript, which has been published lately, called Defense of History and Class Consciousness, Tailism and the Dialectic. And in this manuscript, he tries to explain how what he's doing is compatible with Marxism much more carefully than in the book itself. But he didn't publish it. And it was found in his papers in Moscow 50 years later, only published recently. And actually, I mean, the first publication, the text was written in German, was published in a very obscure Hungarian magazine, and was essentially invisible for some years after it came out. And then it was translated into English. Now it's easy to get from Verso, my publisher. So the answer is, he didn't really have an opportunity to apply the theory to anything outside of his original object. If he had continued, if he'd gone west instead of east and continued to be a Marxist, we'd probably have some very interesting texts on all kinds of social problems where reification is manifest. Yeah. Yeah.
So I was kind of taken in by Habermas's critique of Lukács.
Uh-huh.
So just to spell it out for those who haven't gone that route, he goes through in the theory of communicative action. Habermas goes through Lukács and says,
Yes.
look, there's a normativity problem here. I can't handle it. Like, I need some, to put it into my own words, I kind of need some kind of technology of moral action. I can't just rely on the people. So he says that essentially what Lukács is doing is relying on sort of some generic notion of the proletariat to be the normative guide for action.
Uh-huh.
And he wants to set up instead essentially a kind of technology of moral decision making, which becomes his whole system of universalizability and ideal speech situations. But it all seems to be a kind of reaction against the idea that you can actually entirely get out of some degree of technologized or pre-established decision making. So I'm wondering sort of how you deal with or think through that kind of critique of Lukács.
You know, in 1923, it was already possible to fear the worst. In 1914, all the social democratic parties, which were the Communist Party was a very small actor, except in backward countries like Russia and Hungary. But you could, in 1914, hope that they would veto the war effort by voting against war credits and trying to stop the First World War. They didn't. In every country, they voted for the war. They all became national patriots. That's scary. Marcuse told me the following story. In 1918, he was drafted into the German army at the end of the war. He was a student in Berlin. And he was 20 years old, 19 or 20. He was drafted. And the war ended before he could be sent to the front. And the soldiers revolted at the end of World War I in Germany and formed councils like the Soviets in Russia. And he was elected to the Soviet of the Berlin troop. And so here's this kid, right? He's been reading all these heavy philosophy books and Marx and so on. And he is sent to the meeting of the committee of soldiers who are going to now govern the army. The first order of business, elect the officers for the Revolutionary Army. They elected all the old officers. And so that's when Marcuse figured there was a problem, right? So you could begin to worry. But in 1923, Lukács is coming out of the revolution in Hungary. He's optimistic. He sees that there have been crises and problems, but he imagines that there's a dynamic there which is going to continue and expand. And he's counting on the proletariat, right? Now, by the time Habermas is writing, forget it. There's been Nazism, there's been all kinds of right-wing mass movements that have essentially destroyed the European world, right? The world in which Lukács, of which there were still vestiges when Lukács was writing. So Habermas reacted to this situation by saying, look at Marx making fun of morality in the Communist Manifesto. You ever read the manifesto? He says, you bourgeois say we communists are in favor of community of women, but you're the guys who've turned all these women into prostitutes because you're the ones who pay them, and so on, right? So he just makes fun of bourgeois morality for pages in the manifesto. He doesn't want to base the revolutionary movement on morality because morality can be twisted, can be accommodated to anything. On the money issued by the Vichy regime, the fascist regime in France during the occupation, it says family, country, famille, patrie, travail, family, country, work. These are moral concepts, but they've been totally perverted in the application. So in Marxist, the important thing is not how you talk about morality, but how the historical action is going to liberate humanity in reality. And this is something that's really happening, and we can count on it. Well, by the time Habermas is writing, you can't count on it. So his reaction is to say, well, what we need is an irrefutable standard of judgment by which to judge social movements, so we don't end up, just following the pattern of mass action without actually having any way of knowing if it makes any sense or if it's good or bad. So we need some independent moral standard by which to judge it. And that's why he proposes this quasi-Kantian moral theory. But Marx had already said, forget it. You have to base yourself on the real movement of history itself. Here's the tricky part. What Lukács is doing is to show us how to make and to base ourselves on the real movement of history, but to form an independent judgment of that movement. So in other words, we're not going to base ourselves on a moral theory. We're going to base ourselves on an evaluation of whether this form-content dialectic is actually in play and how it is in play in the struggles of people in history. Is it in play in a way which reveals the potential of the movement to create for people a life that is wider than the limits of the bourgeois forms of economic control, or not? And if it is, then it's deserving of support. If not, then not. But it's an independent judgment that you have to form. You can't just, jump on some bandwagon and expect that to lead you to paradise. Now, the way this is very difficult part of his theory. In the last chapter of the book, he explains the Leninist party. And there's a lot of dispute about the role of the vanguard party in Lukács's theory. Does it fit with this idea of actual rational criteria for judging the movement, or is it just a way of, a fancy way of getting on the bandwagon, right? You do it by leading the bandwagon. That's what the Leninist party does. So, but I don't want to try and settle that one now. I just want to point out that the theory contains the resources for a different, non-moral type of judgment of social movements. And Habermas could have tried to work this out. There are hints of this in his own theory, for example, in the notion of colonization of the life world. Where colonization occurs, you could make judgments in Habermas's theory without recourse to the ideal speech situation and all of that apparatus of discourse ethics. He doesn't choose to do that. He wants to ground everything on his ethical conception. But Lukács would say, ethics is exactly the wrong way to go about it, because wherever there are ethics, there's a reality which rejects the ethics, which refutes the ethics. The very idea of making a moral demand tells us that it's not something that comes from history or from nature. No one makes a moral commandment that you breathe the air. They only make a moral commandment that you don't do the things that are illegal and fattening, right? The fun stuff. The moral demands only come into play where they contradict the real movement of history, of human desire. And so by dialectically, morality is correlated with the temptation to sin, right? So it's impotent by its very nature. So this would be the argument that Lukács would oppose to Habermas's theory and try and, if he were to be confronted with it. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew, for a great talk. So you've have your new book, your new Lukács and Marx book, and how it was a super interesting, highly theoretical talk tonight. But how do you think, really, like sort of in a sort of folk, in a folk way, how do you think that, not in a folk way, but I want to say in non-academic speak, is Lukács relevant for today's social movements? In the way that maybe Marcuse, I remember you telling me everybody had, I think it was you said, everybody in the 60s had a copy of One Dimensional Man in their back pocket, all the students in the movement. So is there something that can ignite the imagination of contemporary radicals, activists, and revolutionaries in that way?
Pass the book forward so Kate can see it.
Oh no.
Well, first of all, Lukács is not writing a book for movement activists, right? It's a very technical, philosophical work. My book tries to explain it in much simpler language than Lukács uses. You heard some of his language. It's even simpler than Fred Jameson's language. And I think it's important to understand it. If you think about one-dimensional man, for example, all that stuff about one-dimensionality, about technological rationality we can relate to, that's really an application of Lukács's concept of reification. So it's not necessary to go back into the history of the theories and try and understand them from the ground up, you know, and at the highest theoretical level. But there are people who are curious and want to do that. In this case, think about the problems that I raised at the end of the talk. Why weren't the women's health movement, the AIDS patients movement, the internet movements, why aren't these welcomed as part of the so-called left, right? What are the boundaries of the left, and what does it really mean to be on the left today? Do we know? I think this is a problem. It was easy in 1942 in the lunchroom of NYU. You could decide whether you were a Trotskyist or a communist or a social democrat. In all cases, you were on the side of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, going to overthrow the system. But I mean, that's not going to work today, right? That kind of. So, what is the left? I went to some of the occupation things. I mean, anybody could speak. Everyone was welcome. Well, I mean, I remember one of the speakers was really concerned about the laws against drinking unpasteurized milk. Should that be part of the left? How would you know? The answer of the Occupy movement was to say anyone can speak, and they did. So, but we need some theoretical substance, right, to hold things together, to give them consistency, and has to take the form of something that connects, something that relates movements. So what is that something, right? I mean, there have been a number of candidates proposed. Like one of the big ones was gender and race discrimination. The problem with gender and race discrimination is that it doesn't seem to get us to the heart of the system. It gets us to a really important problem, many important problems, but the system seems accommodating, right? It's adjusting pretty well to the demands. Still, it's obvious that gender and racial discrimination could occur in any society, not just in capitalist society, and so those movements have what I would call a relatively universal validity. They're valid for all modern societies. It doesn't matter if it's Cuba or China or the US or Britain. So I'm trying to argue that there's another such candidate, which would be struggles around technology, environmental struggles, struggles in medicine, around academic, educational technology. Do you all want to be taught by machines? It's possible. You just won't learn anything, but or at least you won't learn the same things. So, but there's a real push to substitute machines for people in education, right? There's all kinds of things going on, and these also, I think, have the status of relatively universal candidates for defining the left, objects of struggle for defining the left. We need to somehow recognize and integrate these different types of leftist struggle. And how do you do that without understanding what they are, without even knowing how to identify them? So theory is important. I remember Marcuse used to, he was beloved of all these new left spontaneists who were smoking dope and rejecting all leadership and burning books and so on. Not exactly, but anyway, rejecting education. But he would directly address those people and tell them, you're going to need theory and strategy and organization to succeed, because the other guys have theory and strategy and organization. So things are not just going to disintegrate. I mean, I think this is my impression of what one of the popular theories today, the empire theory, right? That somehow things will just disintegrate. It's not plausible. The system is very vigorous. It's very successful at reproducing itself under changing conditions. It's not some sort of a fragile thing that's about to collapse. So I think that such a naive view of political struggle is not going to help us. Or just say everyone is the proletariat. Well, that solves that problem. That's not going to help. You know, that's hopelessly unsophisticated as an understanding of the complex social system that we're living in. So that's why I think it's worth it that people study and learn these difficult things and then figure out how to do what Marcuse did with One-Dimensional Man, right? Bring it back in a form that can be read and it can excite large numbers of people and guide them. So I don't know, that's probably not me, but there's somebody out there who's going to do it. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. The first is, what were the relationship, were there any relationship between Lukács and German thinkers and also German communist socialist movements? What kind of interaction was going on? And the second one is, why the crisis in theory now?
Yeah. The first one is easy. Lukács lived in Germany. He was a part of the circle of Max Weber, this famous sociologist who was one of the leading intellectuals in Germany before World War I. And so he knew everybody, you know, all the prominent intellectuals. Adorno met him when Adorno was a kid, worshipped him till he betrayed the literary modernism by criticizing Kafka. So I don't know if, Ernst Bloch knew Lukács. Lots of people were in touch with him. So he was just part of a relatively small circle that created the German thought of that period.
Did he know Heidegger? I was thinking on the question of technology.
I think that's unlikely. Heidegger was in 1923, Heidegger was a graduate student in Freiburg, studying with Husserl, and probably was not someone who, in the early 20s, Lukács would not have likely met him. Now, it might be that Heidegger read History and Class Consciousness. That would be interesting. Lucien Goldman, a French Lukácsian, wrote a book called Lukács and Heidegger, in which he argues that Heidegger's Being and Time is a right-wing response to Lukács's History and Class Consciousness. It's a very interesting idea. It's probably not true, but it's interesting. But what is true is that they both had a friend named Émile Lasque, who was a very powerful thinker in the Neo-Kantian tradition, and who helped them both to arrive at their position. So both History and Class Consciousness and Being in Time cite Lasque, and he's one of the few people who's cited, who isn't criticized. So the politics of citation was a bit different in those days, right? It wasn't a way of sucking up. So who knows? I mean, it's complicated, all this. The second part of your question is, why is there a crisis of theory? There's a crisis of theory because Marxism is based on the idea that two things have converged. One is technological advance, which has transformed the lower classes, made them capable of working together and understanding the world, broken them out of the religious framework of rural life, rural idiocy, as Marx called it, and sent them into the cities where Engels said the workers no longer are deferential of their betters, they become free outlaws. It's a fantastic passage in Engels in an essay called The Housing Question, where he's explaining why it's so important that the peasants lose their land and be forced into the cities where they will no longer doff their cap to the local notables. So that's one side of it. Technology is transforming the lower classes. The other side is the economic laws of capitalism are heading toward disaster. economic disaster. And what that means is, once you have millions of people who are separate from the land, that means that people's life is at stake, right? The system has to feed them. And if it becomes incapable of feeding them, they will destroy it. And so when those two things converge, you've got the proletarian revolution. All right, well, what happens when the free outlaws vote for Harper? What happens when you can't count on them? You know, they vote the old officers in. The historical movement turns out to be much more complicated and fraught than Marx and Engels assumed in the 19th century. And on the other side, so that's the transformation of the lower classes has not produced a mass revolutionary movement as expected. On the other side, it's also screwed up because there are economic crises, but there are also governments have means for dealing with them. So the crises don't cause mass starvation. So the thing has collapsed. The scheme is broken. So still, the society still is subject to all the criticisms, right? It just is better able to manage its own survival than people expected 150 years ago. So now we got to come up with new theories, or else, you know, just go with the flow. Make sure that to hide all those old Facebook pages in which you talked about revolution. Yeah. There was another hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, Andrew, so I wonder, one of the things I really like about your talk is the very gentle historicizing of Lukács in response to Habermas. I want to ask about shock. Amongst the theorists that you mentioned already who were in conversation with Lukács, shock is this metaphor of anticipation of a de-reified world, or the possibility, although obviously that wasn't. But if I'm right, shock and Lukács, like literary modernism and Lukács, they're in a violent relationship. And I wonder if you could explain that. Why? Why is Lukács so resistant to shock as a
theme?
As a theme, as a strategy that perhaps responds to the theory, the possibility of de-reification.
You know, in the theme of shock is basically due to Walter Benjamin, right? I don't know if Lukács and Benjamin had any contact. I'm sure they were vaguely. I'm sure Benjamin was well aware of Lukács. I don't know about the other generation. Shock is Benjamin's way of characterizing the difference between experience in modern societies, urban societies, and in a village society. Right? In the village, you know everybody. Nothing new ever happens. It's incredibly boring. People sit around and tell each other stories. He says the boredom is the magic bird that lays the egg of the story. Right? In the city, it's constant shock, running up against new experiences, unexpected events all the time. And so the human sensorium is not really adjusted to this because people never lived in big cities before, at least not very many of them. And many of them maybe had a big population, but you know, it's a tiny percentage of the world population. Now, cities become the centers of human experience, and it's a different experience. And shock is his term for this difference. And you could argue, I guess you're arguing that modernist literature as an attempt to somehow incorporate shock into literature.
I would say modernist literature and our art practices of this era, right? And Simmel is talking about, and in all these ways, it just happens to be a particular characteristic of modernism and the response to modernity that that is constant with Lukács' time, but he hasn't absorbed that into his system. In fact, my sense is it's a kind of violent. And I ask this question because in our own time, we live in an age where broadly the massive overstimuli of our age makes shock redundant, if not exhausting. Do you know what I mean? And so what Lukács says about this might have some contemporary relevance in an interesting way.
See, I think the difference is, someone mentioned Simmel, also Simmel and Benjamin focus on this particular phenomenon which alters the texture of human experience. And Lukács is focusing on a different phenomenon, which is coextensive with modern society also, which is the technologization of the social world, right? The submission, the rationalization process. So Zimmel and Weber were the two most exciting, interesting sociologists before World War I. And one of them talks about this change in experience, and the other talks about rationalization. And what Lukács did was he turned the theory of rationalization into a theory of experience. Right? So it's not just that bureaucracies run universities, it's that people who work in universities begin to think, how can I manipulate the bureaucracy? Which means they're part of the bureaucracy. Right? It's just a different way of being part of the bureaucracy, to manipulate it. Students looking for the gut courses, you know, that's what we called them in college. I don't know what they're called today. Easy C. Faculty figuring out how to get the grant or whatever, right? So there's a whole system that's part of the bureaucratization, it's the rationalization of institutions. So what Lukács has done is take this theory of rationalization, turn it into a theory of experience. How does it fit with the other theory of experience that Benjamin was developing? I mean, that would be an interesting thesis to write, article to write. And I don't know exactly how to make the two things work together. But what's clear is that Lukács did not pursue the same path. So he arrived at very different conclusions about the nature of modern society. Yeah. Yeah.
I had a question. I studied in Hungary really briefly, and in the very tiny program that I was in, it struck me that Lukács was perceived as a very kind of polarizing figure, but I didn't have a sense of how he's perceived broadly in terms of what you might know in terms of the Hungary of today, his work.
Well, the Hungary of today is run by a right-wing mafia. So,
but in the academy, that's why I like that.
I think that what happened in Hungary, I mean, Lukács remained loyal to the idea of communism to the end of his life. He, in terms of reform of communism, the furthest he got was something like what the Dubček regime represented in Czechoslovakia. More radical conceptions of democratization of socialist society did not appeal to him. So naturally, once communism fell in Eastern Europe, in Russia, he looked, out of place. His ideas seemed, I think he had died by this time, but there were still people who were interested in his ideas, and they fell out of favor very quickly, and in fact left the country and went to Australia, which can't go much further from Hungary. Now the most prominent of his disciples in his later life is Agnes Heller, and she teaches in New York and is involved in some sort of legal problems, persecution in Hungary. So she still goes back there part of the time, but it's it's not even a question of being out of favor. It's like, from another era. And I don't know what the left in Hungary is like today, but I imagine they're busy just struggling to preserve bourgeois rights against a regime that doesn't respect them. Yeah.
So about the whole theory that reification somehow turns, if I'm not mistaken from what I understand, it turns people and relations between people into things or objects. And so would that theory be applicable also to states of actually existing socialism, like say for example in the People's Republic of China, Cuba, North Korea, those
Sure.
states?
Absolutely. That was the basis. Frankfurt School was critical of the Soviet Union, and criticism is usually alluded to without being developed in any depth. But Marcuse actually wrote a book in the late 1950s called Soviet Marxism, which is a full Frankfurt School critique of Soviet-style communism. And it is based on categories like those that Lukács uses. on the idea of the reification of the regime. So this is another reason, to go back to Alessandro's question, the crisis of theory is partly due to the fact that the Soviets proved to us that it's not all about the commodity form. If that's what you thought, you were wrong. There are other ways of screwing up, you know? So you can produce, because you see, when Marx was writing in the mid-19th century, the civil service bureaucracies and the corporate administrations consisted of a minuscule fraction of the population. Companies would be run by a bookkeeper and an owner, and that's the management. And the workers organized themselves to a great extent within the factory according to some rules laid down by the owner. And the whole idea of these huge bureaucracies that absorb a third or a fourth of the cost of most of the institutions of modern societies, including universities, right? That idea is just unthinkable in 1850, 1860. But once that becomes the way in which societies are run, and Weber points this out with his theory of rationalization, you can already see how there's another source of reification other than the market, and it's the bureaucracy. And that other source of reification is now supplemented also by technology, a third source of reification. These are all ways of establishing forms that people are squeezed into. You know? The forms of their life are shaped by the requirements of capitalism, both on the market and the administration of social institutions, management, and through the technologies made available to them. And so all three of these domains now are locuses of reification. So the Soviet Union, you know, it's just another example. It's not the solution to the problem, or even a halfway house on the way to the solution. That's what it looks like anyway from the standpoint of the theory of reification. Yeah. And of course that's, again, the crisis of theory. How are you going to recast the theory that was based on the idea of proletarian revolution and the problem of capitalism as a market society, and that's no longer the principal source of the problem, the only source of the problems.
We have time for 2 more questions.
I see a hand back there.
Writing in the context of fascism and Nazi Germany and the Hungarian Revolution, do you think Lukács overstated the potency of the proletariat to affect social change, and if so, why?
He certainly was mistaken about the ability of the proletariat to overthrow capitalism, because he thought it would and it hasn't. So that's empirically verifiable. Unless you're holding out for the next revolution. But I think what happened in 2008 is very discouraging for any theory of the revival of the proletarian revolution. So why? Why did he make the mistake? I believe the answer is helpful. It's helpful to look at the Frankfurt School for the answer. The answer is the emergence of mass culture, and on one hand, and state administration of the economy on the other hand. And these two things, which emerge in the 20s and 30s in Western Europe and the United States, make it possible to block the development of radical consciousness. The idea of the alternative is no longer as compelling, and the system is better managed, and people's minds are full of junk. So, Lukács in 1923 could not foresee this. I mean, when does Mickey Mouse first come on the scene?
26.
Yeah. So Mickey Mouse is really the signal that, you know, the new culture that's going to emerge, which Benjamin is optimistic about, much too long. But this new culture that's going to emerge now that religion is broken down as the foundation of everyone's belief system, It's not going to be based on artistic experimentation, on political enlightenment. It's going to be based on commercialism. And that was just unforeseeable before the 1920s and 30s. And that's a huge factor. And of course, we still live with that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.